Professor Po Shen for broadening our perspective and sharing some valuable lessons. Up next is Mr. Chris Malone. He is a partner at Dahlberg Advisors and a global expert in education, specializing in the use of technology in education systems. For the last 3 years, Mr. Chris has led Dahlberg's work in global K-12 education with Google. This has involved the digital transformation of 20 schools across 10 countries and the design and implementation of Google's leading-edge AI tools in school systems. He has supported government policy on technology adoption, including AI, and led Dahlberg's ongoing work with the Hong Kong education system to set the strategy for AI adoption across the board. Please help me welcome him to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. Wow, that's a tough act to follow. I think you may be the only professor that has a more intense performance schedule than Taylor Swift. So as I came to this room today, I started to feel a little bit nervous. And I was wondering to myself, why am I feeling nervous? Perhaps it's because I'm about to keep the company of so many fantastic, talented Vietnamese minds and mathematicians and computer scientists. But actually, I spend quite a lot of time with that type of person. And so it can't be that. And then I realized it's because of the thing I was doing when I was last in this room. And I was last in this room in 2018, doing something very different from what I'm doing now. I was doing a charity boxing match. So I was sitting over there inside a boxing ring, wearing shorts and fighting someone to raise money for Operation Smile. But as you can see, or I hope you can see, I survived on that occasion. And so I hope I also survive today. Okay, so I'd like to talk a little bit about two things that occupy my day job, which is with Dahlberg. But really, I'm here to speak on behalf of Fulbright University, Vietnam. And I'll come to Fulbright in a few minutes. But let me start a little bit with two things that occupy me most of my time, which is working on social impact and on economic development. And I'd like to take you briefly a little west of here to a school in Bangkok, a school in Thailand, Bangkok. And this school is a very interesting school because it's a school for the deaf. All of the students are very severely deaf or partially have impaired hearing. And working with Google as part of a global program that we run, we had the extraordinary experience of putting technology, which of course is powered by AI, into that deaf student's classroom. And we didn't realize the profound effect that it would have. We could kind of simulate and think forward the effect that it would have. But some of the subtle details that came through were really powerful. So one thing that these students have, of course, normally they are constrained to learning using sign language. And that means that they're also constrained to having teaching whenever a sign language a competent person is available. And the infrastructure that we put in is Google Chromebooks, and then all of the Google digital layer with Google for Education and so forth. But behind that system is, of course, the amazing AI tools that we've been hearing about, or we've been hearing about the foundations for those tools, and that powers those tools that those students can now use. And one of the things that means is that now any teacher can walk into that classroom. We haven't had teachers speak different languages, only English and Thai, but either Thai or English language teachers can now walk into that classroom, and those students can immediately understand what that teacher is saying by reading a live transcript on their screens, which is really profound. And one of the most interesting things that I didn't realize before doing this experiment is that sign language is constrained to, I think, a maximum of approximately 10,000, a vocabulary of 10,000. whereas the average language is up to 100,000 vocabulary units, and like the Oxford Dictionary, I think, is 600,000. So if you think about the expansion of detail that those students can now enjoy, it's really spectacular. And that probably wasn't possible 18 months ago in a practical setting. So it's a real pleasure and a privilege to be on a stage or sharing a stage with some of the people who built the foundations that allow these things to happen. And if you think about some of the things that we've seen from the speakers today, the next few years are going to have an extraordinary rate of growth of what can be achieved in the social impact space. And so that's super exciting. I'd like to talk a little bit about the other side of my work, which is economic development, because the question posed here is, how can we benefit? What's the opportunity for AI for Vietnam? And we've heard a lot about some very fantastic specific examples today. And I'd like to go up a little bit to the macro level and talk about the broader picture, because the OECD recently published an analysis of what is conventionally thought of as the AI workforce, and that tends to be less than 1% of a country's workforce. Now, of course, those jobs would be above the 80th percentile in terms of income, generally tertiary or postdoctorate levels of education. So that workforce is typically a fantastic workforce, but it's less than 1% of the population. And so the question that we have started to think about is, if Vietnam has a profound AI center, as it does, and lots of AI talent, what are some of the other industries that could get stimulated by that? Because AI is somehow a kind of assistive or collaborative industry. It helps other industries to grow. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Thinking, as you can see here, about the current economic composition. Actually, we've got a long way to go in Vietnam. What you see here is a comparison of the economic composition of Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi. And you can see how small, actually, these cities are economically compared to some of the other cities in the region. And these other cities have a similar population, actually, to Ho Chi Minh and Hanoi. So, there's a huge opportunity, really. And one of the reasons that these economies of these cities are not bigger is because we haven't really expanded the service economy to the extent that we could. And that's something that I'm going to explore, the role of AI in expanding other service sectors. And the standard that I think we need to ask ourselves is, what's the opportunity in the next 10 years that could be a significant scale, that can allow export revenues, and that can create a lot of jobs and dissipate that potential throughout the population. So one of the sectors I'd like to talk about is a rather, it's not a very sexy sector, one could say, as compared to these beautiful health and educational impacts, but it's a very important sector, which is the business services sector. And so this includes professional services, financial services, IT and technical services, administrative and so on, and a few others. And this sector is the one that is actually adopting AI and using AI the fastest. So McKinsey does an annual study on sort of progress of AI. 20% of firms in this sector state that they are now using AI on a regular basis to help them with their work. And the highest function that uses AI is sales and marketing. So 30% of sales and marketing, or 30% of firms say that they are regularly using AI in their sales and marketing. So what are the kind of opportunities that we're talking about here for Vietnam? Let's imagine we have a financial services firm, a bank in Singapore. That bank needs all sorts of services, not the core activity of asset allocation, but the many other services like fraud detection and customer processing and so forth. And those are really interesting activities for us to think about as Vietnam and see, can we capture those? Or this might be something like a hospital or a large hospital chain, let's say in Kuala Lumpur, that needs coding for its pricing as it reclaims its revenues from an insurance company. Lots of activity, lots of processing and those types of things are critical for that healthcare chain. It's not the core business of the healthcare chain, but it's an important activity. So those are the kind of things I'd like to present an argument to you in the next 10 minutes or so that are really interesting areas for Vietnam to think about, but we can only be competitive in those areas because of the amazing AI talent that we have in this country. Very quickly, I'm just going to skip through some of the emerging research we have. It's just mapping this sector. So if we think about the broad region that we're in, there's approximately 400 billion, more than 400 billion US dollars of activity in this type of sector. Some parts of this sector, it's unrealistic for us to say we can capture in Vietnam. Other parts of this sector are being transformed by AI, and we can think about targeting those and creating opportunity out of that. So approximately, I think some 80 billion, as far as our initial research suggests, is being kind of transformed through AI and is sort of industries that are now on the move. You know, they're changing, the way you do that work is changing, and so we can really think about bringing that to Vietnam. But there are some very important conditions that must be met if we are going to succeed in doing so. Okay, so I'd like to talk about one of two conditions. So this is the slide that makes me the most nervous to put up for two reasons. One is that it says that Vietnamese software engineers are the lowest paid in the region. So maybe some of you at the back are taking notes about the salary levels here. And you will be using Professor Yang's negotiate with my boss for salary increase system in order to have those conversations. But I want to make the point that we have an enormous cost advantage in the country today. Now, I think the future for a software engineer or someone in this sector should be a future of constantly rising income. That's what we want, constantly rising income, but we're starting from a relatively low base today. And if you think about the multiple, at almost 10x multiple between here and Singapore, that's an amazing cost advantage that we have, not just in software engineering, but in many, many other associated services. Now, going to the other side is when I'm really worried I might get some vegetables thrown at me. This is a slightly old ranking about the quality of developers. It's a developer ranking, and it's from a few years back. But I just want to use that to make the point to say that we're good, we're getting better, but we're not the best yet. So we've got some way to go in the country. Now, my compromising comment, so that I hope this, those of you who are reaching for a vegetable to throw at me, is I think that plenty of the developers in Singapore, Australia, and South Korea are actually Vietnamese, right? So those ones that are driving those rankings, I think they might be Vietnamese developers. But the point is to say that our standards, our cost is fantastic, our cost position is fantastic, our quality is good and rising, but we're not quite there yet. Which brings me on to my second condition, which is why I think this is an interesting opportunity, which is what AI does to the services industry. So I'd like to spend a couple of minutes talking about some really excellent studies that some of you may have heard of that show the impact of AI on services jobs. So what you see here is some research from Harvard Business School, from Fabrizio Dell'Acqua, that looks at the effect of AI on the consulting industry that I've spent much of my life in. And this was actually done on BCG, so BCG consultants all around the world. And I guess the thing that I want you to take from this research, which is called the jagged frontier of innovation, is that there was a 40% performance uplift, which you can see on the left-hand side, in the bottom half of the participants. So basically, those that were, medium to lower performers saw a massive uplift in their performance as compared between when they were not using AI and using AI, a sort of, a side-by-side AI tool. And a much smaller increase in the high performers. So keep that kind of 35, 40% figure in your mind. Let's look at another industry. So this is legal services, and the measurement here, so this is work done by Jonathan Choi and others from the University of Southern California. And this one looks at examination performance with or without assistive AI. And a very similar story comes out, which is if you look on the left-hand side, you can see that the bottom quartile, so those who started in the bottom quartile of performance, had approximately 35 to 40% uplift in performance. And what's really interesting is if you come all the way over to the side that I'm standing on, you can see that those that were the top performers at the beginning actually had some deterioration in their performance. So I guess they should have just, sat down and done the legal exam with no technology, and they would have performed better. So a bit of deterioration in performance at the top end, and a big uplift again at the bottom end. Let's talk about one more example. So this is my favorite study on this subject, and this is Professor Yang, your colleague, Eric Brynjolfsson from Stanford. And this study looked at call center workers. And this was call center workers, again, split into quintiles. And you see that the measurement here is the number of resolutions in the call center incident, the speed of the resolutions. And so for these were typically, newer joiners to the company. Over on the left-hand side, you have those newer joiners to the company, and on the right-hand side, you have the more experienced, high-performing ones. So again, a very significant uplift in the performance of the newer joiners over there on the left, and less of an uplift, indeed, some deterioration in the highest performers. Okay, so all of this, just to make the point that if you have a cost advantage in services, but the quality is you're still trying to improve your quality, the role of AI can absolutely transform your performance. And this study was particularly interesting because it looked kind of at the mechanics of how this happens. And in summary, the mechanics are that the AI, which is providing prompts, think about the call center, and you have a screen and suggest this to the customer or ask the customer about this. So you're getting prompts from this system. Basically what happens is that the data, many years of data from the top performers, is basically turned into protocols and suggestions and guides for the lower performers. So there isn't a large external source of data here. It's really just the performance of the top performers without them actively coaching the lower performers. They are effectively coached by the top performers. And that raises this interesting question of, can you give incentive to both of them? Because the lower performers are somehow indirectly benefiting from the skills of the top performers. But we in Vietnam, coming into the services industry and trying to build our position, we can really benefit from this type of technology, and we can benefit from the many amazing AI talents and emerging companies that we have in our sector and in this country, and many of them we've heard from today. And I think, I can turn my attention a little bit to Fulbright, just by way of an example. President Scott Fritzen and I had the opportunity to work on a project relating to Fulbright's digital media, digital presence, so website and so on. And we had the choice we could work with an agency in New York that cost about $500,000. We could work with an agency in Singapore that would have cost about $250,000, or we could work with a Vietnamese agency, which cost $50,000. And We chose the Vietnamese agency. Of course, we have a natural bias to choosing a Vietnamese firm to work with. And we had our concerns. Can they perform up to the level? And we had to manage them closely. But they were pretty good. They're pretty good. We don't regret that decision. But you can imagine that cost difference between Singapore and Vietnam of 5 times. If you can squeeze that performance level in a services firm like that to maybe 80–90% of the performance of the Singaporean firm, then it becomes economically irrational to do anything else. You go with the Vietnamese firm every time. And so that's why there's an interesting opportunity that we should think about here. So I won't spend too much time on this one, just to say there's many, many sectors that we can address in this field. There are many services that are somehow associated with our manufacturing sector. So not manufacturing itself, but supply chain optimization and that type of thing. Those sectors, we can start to expand our services with a domestic demand and then try to export those. But others, like for example financial services, we really need to get out there and start competing and winning business with the best banks in Singapore and so on and so forth. So lots of opportunity in this area, and all of it can be enabled by the presence of the AI industry. I'll conclude with a couple of thoughts on what needs to get done. You could have an entire seminar on what needs to get done, the enabling conditions to move into this industry and to kind of win and build a competitive cluster in the next 20 years. There are many, many things that need to be done. But they, of course, involve the government, certainly higher education, a point I'll finish on, and of course businesses themselves and infrastructure. But this is a space that Fulbright already plays in with our public policy school, and we intend to invest heavily in making sure that we are part of the dialogue to try and help the policy environment so that we can win in these industries, because the policy environment is not quite there yet. We're getting there, but there are many, many things that we need to improve. We have the workforce already, but we need that enabling environment around it. I'll finish with a point on education. It should be pretty clear already to anyone, those of you that are visiting the country for the first time, that we have an extraordinary base of technical talent. We have maths Olympiad winners. We've got fantastic software engineers. This is really truly amazing. And the higher education system just needs to continue to do that. Where does Fulbright sit? What do we try to do in all of this? Of course, we want to contribute to those elite research-oriented individuals who are publishing and so on. Of course, we want to contribute students to that. But the other thing that we want to contribute to is those students who are something of a hybrid, those students who really understand things from a technical perspective, but they're also comfortable with creativity. There are those students that are creative, but they also can think from a commercial perspective and are comfortable interacting with international companies and so on and so forth. And those students, it's hard to train a software engineer. It is damn hard to train a student who can do both of those things. That's harder in a way, but as far as we're concerned, that's also an extremely high value job for the economy. And so, that's one of the missions that we have at Fulbright, and we certainly intend to stay focused on that. So thank you so much for your attention.